The United States wasn't yet 75 years old when it went to war with Mexico to conquer California. The Santa Clarita Valley was in the thick of it, and it was familiar territory to some of the famous names of the era, names like John C. Fremont, Andres Pico, and Edward Fitzgerald Beale. I'm Leon Warden, and this is Legacy, Santa Clarita's Living History. If you've heard of Beale's Cut, the old gash through the mountains in the Newhall Pass, then you already know the name Beale. Tonight's guest has written a historical novel based on Beale's exploits, and I'd like to welcome Larry J. Martin to the show.
Thank you, Leon. It's nice to be here.
Well, thank you for coming to us from Montana is where you live, right?
Montana in the middle of the Rocky Mountains now.
But earlier you lived in?
Born and raised in Bakersfield, spent only 54 or 5 years there.
And I guess that had something to do with generating your interest in Ned Beale?
Well, I think anywhere that you live in the West, you'd be likely to run across Beale's name. He was a quintessential Western hero as far as I'm concerned, and an unsung hero to a great extent. But, you know, Beale Air Force Base up north of Sacramento, a couple of roads in Bakersfield, and a park in Bakersfield, a little, you know, Highway 40, the Interstate Highway 40, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe route, museum in Kingman, on and on.
Now, of course, here in the Santa Clarita Valley, we're a little bit more familiar with Beale's activities in the 1850s and particularly 60s, with the roadway improvement in Beale's Cut in the Newhall Pass, and then with his oil exploration. But your book here, Rush to Destiny, this novel you wrote covers an earlier time in Beale's life, right?
It does. It actually starts with starts with him 5 years old for a page or two, and goes on and into the middle of his career. Basically, the first half of his life concludes with the end of the Camel experiment and his surveying the road.
Now, he was born in, what, 1822, I believe?
I believe that's correct, 1822. He became a midshipman in the Navy due to economic circumstance of his family, and when he was 14, which was common at the time, as a midshipman. Got his education on board ship, and practical and book learning.
Well, what is a midshipman?
Well, a midshipman begins at pretty much as the youngest member on board the crew. There were some 25 midshipmen on board the big frigates. They had a professor on board that gave them their classroom instruction. Plus, they learned all the practical aspects of the Navy. They spent their time in the rigging and up in the sails, and I'm sure they spent their plenty of time caulking decks and swabbing them down. So if they passed an examination, they became a passed midshipman, and then they graduated from there on to a lieutenant.
And Beale did become a lieutenant.
He did.
In the Navy.
It took a long time in those days. You didn't do that very quickly. He became a lieutenant about the same time he was in California, as a matter of fact. So that was much later. But he had an exciting career as a midshipman.
Now, in your book, you cover the period in which he was in the Navy and came over to California. How would you sum up what he did while in the Navy in the 1840s here out California way?
Well, his first brush with destiny it was when he was sent back to England off of the ship that was coming this way. Stockton was on board the Congress at that time. Robert F. Stockton was Commodore. The Congress was his ship of the line. It's where he maintained his office, and it was captained by Samuel DuPont. They came upon a Danish ship that was lost out off in the Caribbean, and Stockton saw, and I had heard that the British had left Barbados on their way to California, and he was very concerned with why the British were coming to California, why they were interested in the West, in Mexican California at that time. So he put Beale on board this poor lost Danish ship and said, "We'll loan you this navigator." With the understanding that you drop him off in Liverpool in the Irish Sea, because you know where you are then. And they did so, and Beale spent 2.5 months in England spying, basically, spent a lot of time in the pubs, talking to a lot of Irish sailors who weren't so preoccupied as to not saying what the English were doing. Mm-hmm. He came back to the United States and met with President Polk and the Secretary of the Navy at that time, and which was quite an experience for a midshipman. In fact, he demanded an audience with Polk at Stockton's instructions and wouldn't talk to anybody else in the Navy. Captains came to him and said, "What do you got to say? You don't get to see the president. You have to talk to me." And he said,
was
"No."
Pushy or headstrong or what?
He was determined, and that was a trait that held him in good stead all of his life.
Mm-hmm. Maybe it would be instructive to fill in a little bit of the background here. In the 1840s, you had Polk in the White House, and he had his eye on the Pacific. The British wanted, you had the Oregon Trail, and everybody was kind of interested in what would happen on the Pacific coast.
We had a little constitution that came out of Texas when Texas still belonged to the Mexicans. The Texans weren't very happy about that, mm-hmm. and we were not real anxious with seeing them declare themselves an independent country, as we weren't too anxious to see the Americans or the gringos in California declare themselves an independent country. Mm-hmm. We had loaned Mexico some $30 million, mm-hmm. And Polk wanted that paid back. And he went to Santa Ana with a message that we'll be more than happy to take Texas and California and the country in between for that $30 million. And Santa Ana didn't agree. And the rest, of course, is history. But
and it wasn't at all clear that the U.S. wouldn't end up at war with England over California.
Well, it not only wasn't clear, but it was a great fear. England was a little different kind of a power than Mexico. They had a navy, mm-hmm. in a major way, and we had lots of ships. We had a lot of skills, but we weren't too sure that we could beat the English, even though we didn't do too badly in the War of 1812.
Right.
But the fleet being off the coast of California, the British fleet being off there, was made us nervous. Mm-hmm. So we sent our own fleet around and. Arrived basically at Monterey just about the same time. We were a little ahead of the British frigate Collingwood, which rolled in there, and there were a lot of nervous folks on both sides. We had our guns loaded and primed as the Collingwood approached.
Mm-hmm. Now, Beale had spied in England, reported to Polk. Meanwhile, his commander Stockton is off of California.
The ship went on, and needless to say, leaving Beale. He caught up with them by taking a commercial mail ship, the Falcon, mm-hmm. took it to Panama, crossed Panama on foot, caught the Chile, another ship, mm-hmm. south to Callao, Peru. He had been made ship's master, by the way, which was an awesome responsibility for a young man at that time. Ship's master was basically the manager of the ship, and mm-hmm. When the captain said, "I want to go southwest," the ship's master was on board and directed all the setting of the sails and actually managed what happened on board and directed the sailors, in addition to the fact he was responsible for all the stores on the ship, mm-hmm. and he was responsible for the navigation. When the Chile went south, Beale made contact again with the Congress at Callao, and they sailed for the Sandwich Islands, which was the standard way to come around the Horn, was to go out to the Sandwich Islands.
The Hawaiian Islands.
The Hawaiian Islands,
mm-hmm.
in order to catch the currents and the winds back to California. It was faster than trying to beat your way up the coast against the current and against mm-hmm. the wind. And they call it uphill then. And Beale they set a sailing record with Beale as navigator from Callao to the Sandwich Islands that has never been beaten to this day.
Really?
Yeah. He was just dedicated and skilled in every endeavor that he took on, and he took on a lot of them.
So he rejoins his ship with Commodore Stockton. Mm-hmm. What year is it now?
Oh, golly. What year is it? It's 1846.
Okay.
Yeah, it's
1846.
July 15th, I think, to be exact, of 1846, when they roll into Monterey.
And you got the Bear Flag Revolt going on, don't you?
You have the Bear Flag Revolt. On board, Commodore Stockton was assigned to take over the Pacific Fleet from Commodore Sloat. Sloat was ill and not very effective because of his illness. He was very sick. He, about the same time, had found out that Fremont had participated in the Bear Revolt. Fremont had just come rolling in to California again, participated in the Bear Revolt, and had actually raised the Bear flag, which the 7th flag by that time to fly over California. And the Bear flag wasn't the Stars and Stripes. And
Right.
We were very interested to make sure that the Bear flag didn't fly very long. Sloat actually raised the Stars and Stripes over Monterey then.
But Fremont, didn't he have an Army commission?
He had an Army commission. He was a captain, but we don't know to this day that he had any orders to take California. Certainly, he had he didn't have that many men. Somewhere in the 100 or so, and there were no written orders. There's still big debates among historians as to who had what orders in California between Stockton, Kearny, who came in with his dragoons across the desert from Albuquerque, Fremont, who came into the north, Stockton. Who knows? Who knows what was unwritten?
It seemed to be kind of a state of disarray out here in California. Was there? I guess there was some political infighting between the Army and Navy and probably just about everybody else.
Kearny, Stockton, and Fremont all signed papers as governor of California. One would believe that there was no lack of ambition on the part of those folks. We had a number of skirmishes up and down California with a number of disparate groups of Californios or Mexicans, some since 1820 Californians. Those battles, had the Mexicans really been organized into any kind of a fighting force, they were everything that I can read and glean. They were, of course, the best horsemen in the world. And they used a riata like no one ever has before or since. And they used the lance fairly efficiently. If they would have had some kind of cognizant force, they'd have been tough to beat. It would have taken us a lot longer to take California.
Well, what was the flashpoint, though? What was the shot heard around the world when the war broke out in 1846?
I don't know that there was a flashpoint. We had Kearny coming in with his dragoons. The Mexicans didn't like that. The Californians didn't like that in any way, shape, or form. They met Kearny at San Pasqual, and the Battle of San Pasqual transpired. Kearny was beaten and bedraggled from coming from Albuquerque across the desert. They met him at San Pasqual on a rainy day. We had paper cartridges at that time in our rifles, and those were wet. And Kearny strung his forces out in a way that allowed the Mexicans to flank him, and we lost somewhere between different historical reports, or say somewhere between 15 and 21 men at the Battle of San Pasqual, and to the best of our knowledge, the Mexicans lost no one.
Well, what though led up to the Battle of San Pasqual then? I mean, hadn't Stockton already pacified everybody in Los Angeles? No, actually, he had landed he'd been in L.A. There were some major conflicts there. They didn't like curfews. The Mexicans had, that tiempo mentality of mañana, and they certainly didn't like being told what to do, really in their own country by a pompous American in uniform. Who was the pompous American in uniform?
Oh, there were a lot of them, but Archibald Gillespie, the Marine, was probably the most pompous and the most hard-nosed and the most. He followed orders absolutely to a T, even when common sense said that it'd be better not to. I mean, he was that kind of a personality. I love this guy because he was incredibly brave, and at the Battle of San Pasqual, he was lanced. His wound was described as his lung was showing, and he fought on and lived to fight again. I mean, he was a red-headed guy and he was tough.
Well, why was Kearny outgunned. Why didn't Kearny have more troops?
Well, I don't know that Kearny was outgunned, really. In fact, he probably wasn't outgunned. He was outlanced and outroped. The Mexicans were so good on their horses that they were able to rope cannons and drag them away. They were able to jerk people off their horses, and those lances reached out a long ways. When you had a rifle, even one with a bayonet on it, didn't reach as long as that 8-foot, 9-foot, 10-foot lance. And they were effective weapons.
Now, I believe in your book you mentioned that I think Stockton didn't he send Kit Carson back east with a message saying that all was well in California?
Well, from one 10-day period to the next, we thought all was well, and then another faction would rise up, and all would not be well, or we would irritate the Mexicans. The different cultures would clash, as they did in California when they set a 10 o'clock curfew, and the Mexican says, hey, we want to drink on. We're not through at 10 o'clock.
So Kearny, though, didn't he send a lot of his forces away before he came to San Pasqual?
Golly, you're making me search back. It's been a long time since I did that historical research, but as I recall, he hadn't sent anybody away. Correct me if I'm wrong, but
at San Pasqual, the commander was Andres Pico, I believe. The
commander of the Mexicans.
The commander of the Mexican forces, right. Was Andres Pico, brother of Pio Pico, and of course Andres Pico is a name that we know here in the Santa Clarita Valley.
And by the way, who crossed paths with Beale on and off for a long time, many years, and they became fast friends.
Now, what was Beale's role at San Pasqual?
Beale had been sent out with a force from San Diego. They'd received a note, a famous note John Sloat had carried and had hidden in an oak tree that was found many years later, the actual original note. But he had carried that note, and the note was terse. It didn't say much. It said, hey, here we are, basically. And Kearny was never one, I guess, to exaggerate. And so Stockton felt like there was no immediacy to them being relieved, and he sent a few men, Beale being one of them, to meet Kearny, and they did meet with them prior to the time they met the Mexicans at San Pasqual, I think somewhere short of Warner Ranch, and Beale was astounded at the condition of those men and those animals, because they were bedraggled from that desert crossing. And he cautioned Kearny when they knew that the Mexicans were in front of them at San Pasqual. He cautioned Kearny about the quality of the Mexican as a soldier. And Kearny did not believe them, and one of the reasons it's thought that maybe he didn't believe them is that he took the advice of Kit Carson, who never feared any enemy and always spoke down about his enemies continually. And as it happened, he should have listened to Beale.
Yeah.
But
the Mexican forces were formidable.
They were formidable, and they were formidable many times after that. And it was because of their skill.
So Beale was actually commended by his fellow.
He went on with Kearny from San Pasqual to Mule Hill. Mule Hill is just 30 miles north of San Diego. Still there, by the way, with a big cross on top. When you pass it, you can see it from the freeway. And at Mule Hill, they were surrounded by the Californios, and they took positions on top of the hill to get the advantage of height. But they were eating their mules, which was why it became known as Mule Hill, and the Battle of Mule Hill. They
a little short on provisions.
They were very short of provisions. They were short of everything, really. Beale said, this is not a good place to be. I think we need to let Stockton know we're here. Beale, Kit Carson, and a third Indian, or possibly one of the Delaware Indians were with Kearny as a guide, possibly Beale's hired man. They took their boots off and snuck out of camp in the middle of the night, the three of them. They were discovered by the vaqueros, the guards, and somewhat of a tussle ensued. All of them lost their boots, and they became separated. As it happened, Beale was wounded in several places from San Pasqual. By the time he arrived in San Diego, he was the first one there of the three, by the way. He arrived in San Diego to enlist Stockton's help in going to rescue Kearny. He was pretty well beat up. He'd been through the chaparral and the cactus and the wounds that he had. It took him almost a year to recover from that. He received some commendations from his peers on board ship as the hero of the Battle of San Pasqual, and it's pretty much come down through history that he was the shining example of manhood at that time.
Yeah. Now, Andres Pico was the Mexican commander at San Pasqual, and Andres Pico would also be, well, he would be involved in the capitulation of Coalinga when John C. Fremont camped here in the Santa Clarita Valley before driving north into the San Fernando Valley and accepting Andres Pico's sword. Now,
and we thought that when we accepted the sword, that we won, as a fact that Andres Pico was one of many who had a following of tough Mexicans.
Well, the war would drag on another year or so, but after the war then, though, Beale and Pico met up in the gold fields,
They
right?
did. They met in the gold fields. They met several times thereafter, and Beale had a way about him. He extended his hand to Native Americans that he had done battle with. He extended his hand to the Mexicans and the Californios that he had done battle with. He never seemed to carry a grudge, with the exception of a couple of politicians and a few newspaper people that didn't speak too highly.
Newspapers weren't always merciful.
No,
you know, up in the goldfields, though, Ned Beale played a particular role. I mean, James Marshall discovers gold up at Sutter's Fort in January 1848.
And I think one of the more historically significant things that Beale did was the fleet was off the coast of Mexico. They heard rumors of this gold discovery in California, fabulous rumors. And Beale was dispatched to go to San Francisco and prove or disprove these rumors.
Right.
He arrived there to find that, in fact, there were some major discoveries that had been made. With his own money, he bought an 8-pound nugget. He learned that a fellow by the name of Cump Sherman, who was the captain of the Presidio and the commander of the Presidio at the time, had already dispatched 10 soldiers to cross the country with news of the California gold discovery to Congress.
Cump Sherman as in William Tecumseh Sherman.
As in William Tecumseh Sherman. Later become a little more famous. And Beale went south on a Goleta, met up with the fleet. The commander then said, go on to Washington with this news and beat the army. Beale sailed to Mazatlan, crossed really what was still war-torn Mexico, full of banditos, and crossed to Veracruz, took a ship north to New Orleans, or another ship around Florida and north, and beat the army to Congress with the news of the gold discovery by 10 days. Interesting footnote to that was he met with Polk that day, rolled out this 8-pound nugget and said, California's full of gold. And Polk made a note in his diary at the end of that day that nothing of significance had happened that day. The newspapers thought otherwise.
I bet they did.
And it was highly publicized, and thus began the biggest migration, certainly in the history of the United States, and I think in the history of the world at that time.
Sure. And statehood comes in 1850, and then Beale, well, you mentioned that he was kindly toward former enemies and everybody else. Tell me a little bit about the Sebastian Indian Reservation up at Fort Tejon.
Well, Beale kind of migrated in and out of government jobs. He was very friendly with Thomas Hardin, Fremont's father-in-law. He was his own father-in-law. He married Mary Edwards. Her father was a congressman. So he was closely connected to the government in a lot of ways. Didn't have political aspirations himself, but he got an appointment as superintendent of Indian Affairs in California. And the general consensus, Governor, I think McDougal at that time, had written a letter to Washington saying that we either need to educate or exterminate the Indians. And that was a general consensus among a lot of Californians that, you know, they were like vermin and they should be killed. And Beale was always a humanitarian, and I don't think I've ever used that word about him before, but he really was. And he fought for Indian rights, and he fought to get the reservations done, and he actually put a reservation on at San Sebastian on the Tejon Ranch, and not only did he establish the reservations, but he got those people to work. He got them to build zanjas or irrigation facilities. He got them farming, and he had the same kind of a good attitude toward the Chinese, which were also basically thought of as vermin by most of the gringos that were in the field. He took very good care of those people, and he knew that they were among the most industrious people on the earth, and as was proved during our building the railroads.
Beale wanted to build a wagon road across the West.
He did.
Tell me about that.
Well, he got a commission to build a wagon road. There was a guy who was a Secretary of War at the time by the name of Jefferson Davis, who we'd hear more from in the Confederacy later on. Davis had an idea that camels would work in the Southwest and would be a great attribute to transportation. So they wanted a camel experiment. Beale put together 30 camels. They drove from Indianola up through to Albuquerque and began the survey for a wagon road from Albuquerque this way.
Yeah, I think we're talking 1857.
I think that's probably exactly right. And Beale, of course, they had a lot of trials and turmoils, but he loved the camel, and the camel proved to be an incredible animal. I mean, he would eat mesquite. He would live where the mules and horses couldn't live, and he had incredible feet that could stand the desert. I mean, they've been for, I don't know, a million or so years been tromping across the desert, so they had no problems. One of the interesting things that happened on that trip is High Jolly was there, and names that Greek George, names that we all would recognize out of history. They came to the Colorado River, and Greek George and High Jolly said, "Hey, camels don't swim. You know, we don't come across water in the homeland of the camel. They don't swim. So how are we going to get them across the river?"
Right.
And Beale said, "The devil, they don't swim." He says every animal swims, and mounted the white camel that he was partial to. I think Saeed was his name, and whipped him up toward the Colorado, and to Greek Georgia and High Jolly's great surprise, the camel leapt in and swam the river.
And guess what? Camels swim.
Yeah, exactly.
So he drives his camels out from Fort Defiance out to the Colorado River. The idea, well, I guess there were actually quite a few people who were charged with mapping a wagon road out west.
You know, and finding railroad routes later on. Everybody had their own axe to grind too.
But the Army ended up getting rid of the camels.
They did. Jefferson Davis's ideas fell out of favor when he became the head of the Confederacy.
I guess so.
And just about everything that he had done was ignored. And it was too bad, because the camel could have been a real integral part of the Southwest.
I believe you mentioned that Beale and Pico caught up with each other several times.
They did.
Of course, after this is a little bit more of where we get to know about Beale, because we've got Pico Canyon here in Newhall, named for Andres Pico when he was hanging out by Mission San Fernando at his Pico house, and he was up here in this area pulling asphalt out, carrying it down and using it for tar on roofs and things like that. Now, Beale would end up involved with Pico in an oil concern.
He was involved in what's the help me?
Los Angeles Petroleum Mining District, San Fernando Mining District,
and Star Oil Company.
And Star Oil Company.
Star Oil Company. He had some 25% of that ended up being Standard Oil of California. Beale was an entrepreneur, and he looked for opportunities such as Beale's Cut, which he which he went under contract, I think, with the Board of Supervisors, the Board of
Supervisors,
Commissioners,
right.
or who, whatever they call
Yeah, County
themselves
Board of
at that time.
Supervisors, right. To improve the road through Newhall.
Right, built that cut and then built a toll gate at the bottom of it and said, come on up, fellows, for 50 cents apiece.
Yeah. I think today we'd call it extortion, but...
Could very well have been. At that time, you know, business ethics were a little different than they are today.
Did Tom Mix really jump over Beale's cut?
Not in the photograph that you've seen, he didn't, unless he had a horse, Pegasus, had a horse with wings.
We do know, though, that in Stagecoach, they drove a stagecoach through Beale's cut in the 1939 John Wayne movie Stagecoach.
I'll have to, when I rewatch that movie for the 100th time, I'll have to look for it.
Yeah, he goes from Monument Valley to Monument Valley by way of Beale's cut. With that, I'm afraid we're out of time, but I want to thank you for... Thank you for being here with us and sharing your stories about Ned Beale.
Absolutely.
For more information about Beale and Santa Clarita Valley history in general, visit scvhistory.com on the internet or stop by the Saugus train station in downtown Newhall weekends 1 to 4. Thanks for joining us for this edition of Legacy, Santa Clarita's Living History. I'm Leon Warden. Good night.